Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Singapore. It's great to see my old friend, Ang Cheng Guang, again. I'll be meeting a number of old friends during my stay here. Let me also thank RSIS and NTU for organizing this talk today. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Singapore and China, of course, is a big story in itself. I'm not going to talk all that much about that today. I would be happy to take questions and to discuss it a little bit further with you later on. What I am going to do is to try to provide an overview of a book that was published now 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, which has created a lot of discussion, particularly in the United States and in China itself, but also in other parts of the world. One of the countries where it has been discussed a lot is in India, because of the Indian relationship to China and the need, I think, which many Indians feel in order to learn more about China, its past and its present. So China today is a global affair. It's not just about China's own development, it's also about China's international interactions. And one of my basic starting points for this book is that the two are connected. And they're connected very, very closely. I first came to China more than 35 years ago as a foreign exchange student at Beida, Peking University, at a point when I think there were about 20 or 25 foreign students at that institution, and about half of them were, as we used to call them, politicos of some sort, belonging to various Maoist groups from around the world. And those of us who were not, I was 19 at the time, did not find it particularly enchanting to have to get up at 6:30 in the morning to shout Maoist slogans. So I could easily have been turned off China, but I wasn't, in part because of a fascination with Chinese language and culture, but also, maybe first and foremost, because of this remarkable journey that the country has been on for those 35 years. It's been probably the greatest luck in my life in terms of my professional activities, that I've been able to follow China throughout that time period. And as all of you in this room will know, it has been a remarkable transformation. When I first studied in China, the central shopping street in downtown Beijing, Wangfujing, had 2 restaurants that were open to foreigners. And you couldn't eat in any of them without the written permission of your work unit, your Danwei. You had to get someone who was in charge to sign this. You couldn't just go in and pay for your meal. You had to make sure that you had a political permission, as it were, to write there. And look at Wangfujing, look at all of Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou or Hangzhou. I was up there last week, today, and what they look like. It's a tremendous transformation. It's changed the daily life of hundreds of millions of people, mostly for the better. China is a far better place to live in today for almost all of its population than what it was 35 years ago. And that significant improvement, not just in terms of living standards, but also in terms of governance and in terms of a lot of other aspects that China still at times find challenging, is of course the big story that underpins my own engagement with China. So when I decided to write a book that deals with China's interaction with the outside world for roughly a 250-year period, I had already decided that I wanted to make it a China-centered book, because so much of what is written about China's international affairs is written from the outside in. It's written in terms of how other countries see China, or even if it's trying to reflect what goes on within China, it's mainly based on foreign sources. It's based on information that does not, in its origin at least, emerge from within China itself. So I wanted to do that differently. I wanted to do a China-centered history of Chinese international affairs. I did not want to see China in light of what happened elsewhere. I wanted to look at how China's own development since the High Qing era, the middle part of the Qing dynasty in the mid-18th century, and up to today, how that had developed, how the foreign and the domestic had interacted. And the reason why it's possible to do that today, it wouldn't have been possible, certainly not 35 years ago, probably not even 10 years ago, is because of the changes that have taken place within China itself. China today, in spite of all of its faults with regard to this, is a much more open society in terms of getting access to information than what it used to be. And that's what makes writing a book like this from a Chinese starting point possible. You can at least aspire to get the kind of information that would be useful for you in terms of understanding China's interaction with the outside world from a Chinese perspective. Now, when you write a book, and Xiangguan and I were just talking about this, when you write a book from a very broad perspective, you have to struggle with a few issues that have to do with definitions and what kind of entities you are really going to deal with, what kind of concepts you are really going to deal with. And in the case of China, again, as many of you will know, that's not always easy. It isn't all that easy to define what China is. For most countries, this is not a problem. You can define them quite easily in terms of their past, in terms of their culture, in terms of their geographical form, in terms of their state building, etc., etc. That's not easy to do with China. It's so big, it's so complex, it has such a deep history in terms of its background, a complex, often contrary history, if you look at it from one century to another, that it's really not easy to define what it is. I have a multifaceted definition of the China that I tried to deal with in this book, and it goes something like this. China is a culture, first and foremost. But it's also a state and a geographical core, a geographical center, around which identities and boundaries and definitions of purpose have shifted and adjusted for a very long time. This is changeability, this malleability of China that I try to get to the core of in this book, and therefore the title, Restless Empire. As some of the reviewers, particularly in the popular press, have picked up on, this is a very deliberate attempt to get away from the old stereotype of China as being never changing and inward looking. For almost all of its history, China has not been inward looking. It has been outward looking. Look at the people of Chinese origin who are here. It has engaged with the rest of the world in very definite and very, very clear forms. But the purpose of these engagements have not always been clear, have not always been easy to follow, because it had shifted and it has adjusted for a very long period of time. That said, one has to be careful with making everything about understanding contemporary China about change and restlessness. It is the main part of my story, but of course there are also more profound preoccupations, deeper preoccupations from the deeper past, in a way, that you cannot avoid dealing with. And it is a big challenge when you write a book like the one that I've been trying to do here. Of course, so much has changed over time that getting to these issues that Chinese have been preoccupied with for a very, very long time, particularly in their interaction with the outside world, is difficult. And you could just come up with some, I think, rather rudimentary understandings of what these are. But here are three of them. Here are three preoccupations, let's call them that, from China's deeper history, going back possibly as far back as 1,500, 2,000 years, at least back to the Tang, probably even further back than that. And there are many of these, but there are three of them that I find particularly interesting. One is what you could call a concept of justice, or principle. In Neo-Confucian terms, Li, the principle that underpins the order of things. Now, again, many of you here will know this. This is a very different concept of justice from Western, from European concepts of justice that tend to be oriented somehow towards distributive justice of some sort. That's not at the core of this concept. What's at the core of it is order, is a certain way of seeing and constructing the world. Sometimes it can be about hierarchy. But it's always about a certain sense of fairness and obligation, about recognizing the essence of things, central to, especially to Neo-Confucian thought, but to much of Chinese thought, I would say, over the past 1,000 years in general. But also through understanding their essence, the order in which they ought to stand with regard to each other. And that, of course, is part of the issue, I think, when you look at China's relationship to the outside world. There is a profound sense among many Chinese today that China has been treated very unfairly, has been treated very unjustly by the outside world, that China has not received the position that it ought to have within the kind of ideal framework that should be constructed. Now, justice is not only about that. It's not only about place internationally, but it's also about that. And I think anyone who tries to understand China's foreign relations today who do not grasp that are bound to get into trouble, because it's always there. It's always part of the equation in terms of the thinking that's developed. Secondly, second preoccupation is a preoccupation with rules and with rituals. Now, you have to be very careful here. When I say rituals, a lot of Westerners especially, but also some Chinese, would think about the old imperial rituals, kowtowing in front of the emperor, making sure you hit your head on the ground sufficient amount of times not to be decapitated. Yeah. Much worse than hitting your head, actually, particularly during the Qing dynasty. That's only a small part of what this is about. It is much more about regulations that are set up in a reasonably straightforward, practical sense, both during the Ming and the Qing and the Republican era, in order to interact between individuals, families, state units, and the outside world. This is the reason why so many Chinese in the late 19th century, when the interaction with the West started to expand, that they were interested in international law, in Western international law, post-Westphalian international law, because it was widely held, not unreasonably, that this was the way in which the rules were set for international society. And it took quite a time, I think, for Chinese intellectuals to understand that that may be what the international law books say, but it's not always the way Western powers behave. When it comes, particularly when it comes to, of course, in their case, how they behave towards China, but also in a broader sense. China is not unknown to turn rules and rituals to its own advantage, no less than anyone else in the world. But there was this profound idea, which I think you see in many ways reflected right up to today, that there must be a set of rules and rituals that all countries engage in. Look at present-day China's preoccupation with the UN Security Council and what goes through the Security Council. Its preoccupation with sovereignty. It's very broad, very wide definition of sovereignty and what it means. I think much of this goes back to the rules and rituals preoccupation. And then finally, of these three, what you could term a sense of centrality. And this is important. But it's not the kind of centrality that a lot of people who look at this very superficially would indicate. I mean, there are some people, again, I must say particularly Westerners, who define the name of China, Zhongguo, as a kind of statement, as a kind of slogan, you know, the Middle Kingdom, the Central Empire, which of course is not the etymological origin of China at all. It meant a group of states that came to prevail in the 3rd and 4th century BC over their rivals, over their neighbors. One of the first successful alliances in Chinese history. So it's not about that. What it is about, I think, profoundly, is culture. It is about the idea that most Chinese share, that China is the origin of a shared culture within a much larger region in Eastern Asia. Through other countries, other peoples, having taken over Chinese script, Chinese literature, Chinese ideas, and made them their own. that idea of China as the origin, the originator of a common culture, is very, very deeply held. And I think profoundly important for those who try to make sense of China's relationship to its immediate neighbors today. The idea that other countries, and of course in the 20th century we're first and foremost talking about Japan, other countries could come to substitute for that Chinese centrality that is culturally defined, is something I think that most Chinese find abhorrent in the way that inhabitants in most other countries, even countries that have a slightly similar history, would not really have been engaged with at the same level. So these are just three of those issues that come out of the deeper past. But the book is mainly about how you take those kinds of issues, those kinds of preoccupations, and how you try to deal with them over the 250-year period that I look at. It's more than long enough to try to write about in one volume, I can assure you, even though there are temptations sometimes to go further back in time. Let me tell you a little bit about how the book is put together. And it's not just a book about political and diplomatic and military history. In fact, as I started working on it, some of those issues became less important than what I thought they would be initially. It is very much a book about emigrants and immigrants, or people who travel, both Chinese and foreigner. It's about businessmen, it's about missionaries, it's about people who go abroad from China to get their education and who return and become intermediaries between China and the outside world. That, you will know, is a process that is still very much ongoing. And these people are incredibly important in terms of understanding China's international past. People like a guy called Wang Hong, known outside of China, maybe in the United States, as Yong Wing, was the first Chinese who graduated from a Western college. He graduated from Yale in 1854 and then spent the rest of his life being a mediator between the Chinese culture that he had grown up in and the outside world. For a very long time in China, for political reasons that you will all be aware of, these people have historically been sidelined. They're sort of seen as not quite Chinese enough by people in the PRC and not quite relevant enough by people who looked at it from the outside in. I think these people play a very, very important role in terms of China's international history and need to be looked at more in depth. One of my favorites, by the way, is a guy called Eugene Chen that some of you may have heard about. Born in Trinidad of a Chinese father and a Creole mother, third generation Trinidadian, never learned to speak Chinese. Decided in 1918 or thereabouts, at the end of the First World War, that he wanted to go and live in China, and ended up serving twice as China's foreign minister in the late 1920s and early 1930s. These kinds of families, these kinds of connections, through the Chinese diaspora that you all will know much about, are very significant, are very important. And that leads me to probably the central position that I take in this book. My students often ask me when I was working on this, because this is how I push them, so Professor Westad, what is your interpretation? You know, what is your analysis in this book? And it's very hard to have one interpretation of 250 years of Chinese history. So I used to say to them, I don't have an interpretation, but I have a significant position. And that significant position is that the making of modern China up to today was a metamorphosis. That the China we're looking at today is a hybrid created from domestic and foreign influences alike. That more than most other countries, with a few exceptions, and I'll talk more about this later on, China is indeed international. The China that we look at today have been formed by things that happen outside of China, be it Marxism or capitalism or whatever way you want to look at it, than most other countries. And part of the reason for that is the Chinese ability to embrace change, to take change and make it one's own, to perpetuate change, not always in a positive direction, it should be said, but to steep oneself in ideas that come from elsewhere and become part of them. I know of no other country in the world that can do this in a similar fashion, except perhaps the United States of America. And one of the things that I develop in this book are some comparisons between China and the United States in the 20th century, where I find a striking number of parallels. Countries where people, individuals, families can read themselves, often several times over, play a lot of different roles in very quick succession, which to a rather old-fashioned European like myself is sometimes mind-boggling. But there is that comparison, which I think is important. Now, in order to understand this, you have to understand quite a bit about China's past. You can't just understand, I mean, if you try to take a sort of snapshot of China, starting as many people now do actually, particularly people who want to go to do business in China, in the late 20th century, you won't get this. You have to look at it in a broader sense. You have to go back, I think, particularly back to the Qing dynasty. You have to understand the Qing state project, which is, again, very often written off, as you will know, because one looks at the way it collapsed in the early 20th century as being a kind of, the kind of inward-looking, backward China that both its population and the outside world reacted against in the end, and therefore it collapsed. The real history of the Qing is nothing like that. For most of its period in power, the Qing were remarkably successful at what they did. It also helped, of course, that they were armed to the teeth. Everyone else in this region, and even further away, were deadly afraid of them. They had a tendency to come back again and again and again. And I think it's important to understand that background, that Qing background, the Qing Empire as a political project, first and foremost. Forget about the Manchus. I mean, the emperor was a Manchu, the imperial families were, but the Qing as a political project was composite. Chinese, of course, tribes from China's northeast, Koreans, Mongols, Russians, people further away than that. The chief foreign policy advisor to the Qianlong, the great Qianlong emperor, who was in charge when my story starts, was a Croat, born on the Dalmatian coast, but lived most of his life in China. This was not an inward-looking empire. This was an empire that understood very much about how the rest of the world worked and trying to impose its rules and regulations on it. And it's only when you understand that, I think, that you are able to understand the economic and social transition, which is very important to me, that happens in the 19th and the early 20th century. China, in spite of the weakness of the state during this late period of Qing rule and the early part of Republican rule, was not as a society in a process of collapse. Quite on the contrary, the transition that takes place in the late 19th and early 20th century is for many Chinese, at the levels of their families, almost a kind of liberation. I mean, an ability to do things that could not easily be done before because new knowledge becomes available. This is not about politics. This is mainly about two things. It's about knowledge and it's about business. It's about opening up opportunities that hadn't existed before. And these Chinese families, they grasp them immediately when they have the opportunity, in a way that is not all that different from what is happening at the same time in the rest of the world, you see. So this is another idea, is that the modern transformation of China is something very new. No, I mean, it happens roughly at the same time as it happens everywhere else in the world, with the exception of some very few areas. Most of England, most of Britain, the Low Countries in northwestern Europe, and some pockets elsewhere, some parts of North America. But for most of Europe, this happens roughly at the same time as it happens in China. I often use my own grandparents as examples here, who were West Norwegian peasants who moved into the city around the turn of the century to start working as industrial workers, roughly at the same time as a very large number of Chinese also moved into the cities in order to find work, and thereby met new ideas, new concepts that had been entirely foreign to them before. The transition in terms of outlook on life, you could say, from magic of various sorts to science. And it happens very, very quickly. It happened quickly, I think, with my grandparents. It happened very, very quickly in China. I love this story that the great Chinese 20th century writer and poet, Guo Moruo, tells in his biography. He went to school in the early part of the 20th century. This is probably from around 1902, 1903. And he tells about one of his science teachers. This was a mixed school, so traditional Chinese and Western science at the same time. One of his science teachers who was giving a class in astronomy. And of course, he sort of merged Western and Chinese traditions in terms of presenting this and found no difficulty in doing so at all until he came, unfortunately, to an expression where he misread the second character of the expression Tianran Yingxiang, natural conditions, as Tianlong Yingxiang, the appearance of heavenly dragons. And then he starts interspersing his astronomy lecture with manifestations of celestial creatures that cruise the sky, and then he immediately jumps back to something that anyone interested in Western astronomy at that point would have understood. This is not a long transition. This is something that happened very quickly. People can take on board new ideas very, very quickly. And China in the late 19th and early 20th century was very much like that. This didn't happen in the 1980s and 1990s. It happened much, much before then. So what you could do, this is a sort of historian's trick of the trade. Guan will know this, others will know it as well, is that you try to periodize, you try to come up with time periods in which you can break down the subject that you are discussing. And I've tried to do that from the late 18th century on, in terms of what characterizes China's interaction with the outside world during that period. The first period, from the 1880s to the 1930s, I call the Age of Openness, using a term from my friend Frank Diekhatter, who now teaches history at Hong Kong University. And it was indeed an age of openness. I mean, remarkable openness to foreign ideas, to changes in ideas, the introduction of Marxism, the introduction of different forms of foreign religion, very important into China. The weakness of the state helped with regard to this. If the state had been stronger, it almost certainly would have tried to regulate this in a way that would have been more problematic. It wasn't able to do so. And as a result, you find Chinese of almost all backgrounds picking up what they think they can make use of in terms of this foreign information that they get in. And they do so very quickly. And they establish international networks, some of them through Southeast Asia, through Singapore, that benefit from the kind of knowledge that they can get. That's what I mean by the age of openness. Then, from the 1940s and up to the 1980s, or thereabouts, you have what I call the Soviet era in China. And I call it the Soviet era not because of the alliance between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, at least not first and foremost, but because of the immense popularity that Soviet ideas, specific Soviet-Russian ideas of modernity, had in China during this period. And that's not just true for the Chinese communists. I mean, when you look at the historical record, what you find is that a lot of people in China, particularly younger people in China, were born, let's say, in the 1880s, 1890s, thereabouts, started taking a very strong interest in how Soviet society was organized, because it seemed to them that it satisfied two of the key aspects that they were looking for in terms of China's own future development. It was modern, and it was just at the same time. It combined a sense of justice with a high level of modernity. It was not in that sense, an imperialist Western country. You could have it all if you embrace the Soviet model, through planning, through centering in on a new form of state. Very often today, we overlook how powerful that was at the beginning of the century. And the number of people who were willing to accept that, with all the limitations that there was to it, rather than going from other forms of modernity that many Chinese saw as being much more problematic, much more difficult for them. The slogan, "The Soviet Union today is China of tomorrow," meant much more than just a membership in the Communist Party. It meant something about state construction and social organization. And it didn't end when the Sino-Soviet alliance broke down in the early 1960s. When I came to China in the late 1970s, the Soviet era was alive and well. I mean, I've given you the example of how dining out in a restaurant was organized. But you can look at the Chinese university that I was part of. I mean, I'm a proud alumnus of Peking University. But I must say that in the 1980s, perhaps to some extent even up to now, it is organized in a strikingly Soviet fashion. I mean, in terms of how it is built up, how it's run, how it's dealt with. So this is social as much as it is political. And I think, again, this is one of the things that it's easy to neglect and forget, but it has a tremendous importance for China today. And then, from the 1980s up to today, continuing, we have what I call the American era in China. And I use the term American very deliberately. It's not a Western era. It's not a, for that matter, market-oriented era. It's a very distinctly American era. With American models, for anything from marketing to management to social organization to television series and films, universities, whatever you have, that have come to take over in China in a very sort of rapid kind of succession. Now, some people don't want to look at it that way. They say, I mean, China is very different from the United States, and of course it is. But it's not different in the ways, in terms of many aspirations that both Chinese leaders and the Chinese general public have. The form of modernity that I think they are closest to today is not a European form of modernity, it's an American form of modernity. Of course, transmitted through a Chinese framework. The statistics that I like the best on this, and you've got to the point now where you can actually do public opinion surveys in China, is with regard to the market, the capitalist market, and people's approach to it. And this is very recent. I think it's only about 2 months ago. A public opinion survey, global one, which asked the question, do you think that the market will be able to solve your personal problems over time? In China, 74% of the Chinese interviews said that they thought the market worked for them. Not maybe now, but eventually it would. 74% of all Chinese. 70% of all Americans thought the same. What do you think the figure was in France? Any guesses? About 30%. In Spain, it was even lower. And this is not just a reflection of the current economic crisis, far from it. It has to do with a basic idea about how society is oriented and what matters. And this informs the links between individuals in China, first and foremost, through families, and society and the state to a very, very high extent. My guess is that in these senses, China is going to become more similar to the United States, not less similar, over a longer period of time. Of course, I also discuss in this book, I won't have time to go through it now, but we can talk about it if you have questions later. So key moments, key transformations in China's history that can only be caught by looking at specific points of development. I talk a lot about Japan, as you may have guessed, because of the complexities of China's and Japan's interaction from the late 19th century and up to today. The main point I make there is that this is a complex history, not always negative, not always confrontational, the degree to which young Chinese and young Japanese were inspired by each other in the early part of the 20th century is really striking. Someone like Sun Yat-sen took much of his own inspiration from Japan. In the very last piece of writing he ever wrote, he said that if there is one good thing that a young Chinese can do for his country today, Sun said, it is to learn Japanese in order to understand, how a transformation could be carried out. Deng Xiaoping said, not often quoted but entirely true, China cannot rise against Japan. It can only rise with Japan. And of course, the current Chinese leadership do not always seem to take this into consideration. Neither do leaders in Japan, for that matter. I talk a great deal about the Chinese diaspora. I'm not going to go further into that here, but I mean, the significance of it is very clear to anyone who lives in Singapore. The interaction, particularly the interaction that took place in the early part of the 20th century, but also at the end of the 20th century. The degree to which overseas Chinese, not just Nanyang Chinese, but from all over the Chinese diaspora, came to have an impact on China's market transformation is very, very important to understand. And then I talk a great deal about the 1970s. Why the 1970s? Well, because that decade, written large, sort of from 68, 69 up to 1983, 84, was the period in which China went through probably the quickest, the most rapid transformation that it's ever seen. Lot of rapid transformations here, but that's the quickest one. And the one that has the most global impact and the most significant impact. From the Cultural Revolution, the depths of the Cultural Revolution, I could say, over onto the period of reform and opening in the early 1980s. In many ways, for the 20th century, this was the real Chinese Revolution. This was the real transformation of China. And then, not just because I am preoccupied with today's international affairs, but because I also think it belongs in a book like this, I talk quite a bit about today's international situation with regard to China. I talk about borders, I talk about neighbors. China today and for the foreseeable future is not going to be a global power, at least not in anything that moves beyond economics and trade. It's going to be a regional power, and that is the aspiration, I think, for its leadership as well. But it's very difficult to become the leading regional power when there are so many conflicts between China and the world that surrounds it. So I think reducing that level of tension from Japan to Korea to the South China Sea to relations with India is crucial for China's future development. I also think China's interaction with the outside world, as you are seeing in Singapore, perhaps more than anywhere else, will be concentrated around technology and trade. Import of technology, the expansion of Chinese trade, and to some extent Chinese investment abroad as well. In this sense, China is different from any other rising power that we have seen before, if we think about it in an historical sense. It's much more integrated with the existing global system, not only the global economy, but also the global economy, than any big rising power has ever been before. Very different from what the situation was, for instance, when the United States rose to global predominance in the late 19th and especially in the early 20th century. Much less interactive in terms of its engagement with the outside world than what China is today. Again, the best statistics that there are many you could use for it, but the one statistic that I really like is, and many of you will know this, is about the development of foreign direct investment in China. So China, even now, in its most developed sectors, meaning those that are dependent on import of technology and are mainly pointed towards foreign exports, the level of FDI is only a little bit less than 60%. That is unheard of in a global context, and maybe problematic in economic terms. We can talk about that later on. When Japan was at a similar stage of its development, its figure of FDI was about 6%. In South Korea, it was even less, in the mid-1970s, when South Korea was roughly at the same level as it is now. So, of course, this tells you that China, whether its population or its government want it or not, are very much involved in what is happening internationally, tied in. That doesn't necessarily mean peace. In this anniversary year of the First World War, we are reminded that interaction does not always mean peace. But it certainly tells us a lot about links between China and the outside world and how these have developed. And then finally, I think the biggest challenge that China is facing, and it won't surprise you, I guess, to hear me say this, is not really in terms of its international affairs. It's in terms of its governance. China today, in far too many sectors, is just very badly governed. It has a political system that is outdated for its purpose. Increasingly large number of people in China see that. This is not an argument about democracy, I mean, in a sort of any meaningful sense, but it is an argument for pluralism and for the ability to discuss things openly. China, as a state, probably as a state more than as a society, is today suffering from the inability to do that. And therefore, a lot of good alternatives and possibilities that should be there in terms of furthering that state's aims internationally as well as domestically are lost. Think about the relationship, for instance, between the center and the provinces. Exceptionally unclear in most cases, with, on paper, a very high degree of centralism, which in reality is almost impossible to carry out because of China's size and because of the significance of the various provinces themselves. And here I'm not talking about Tibet or Xinjiang or the minority provinces. I'm talking about the main Chinese provinces. And in order to deal with that, I think China needs to become more open, more pluralistic, more like it was in the early part of the 20th century in terms of debate and discussion than what it is now, because I think China as a country would be better served by that. I think I've landed there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.